I really wish I had music. Music. Imagine music playing here. Music. Music. As opposed to me singing in your ear. Which, admittedly, I'm sure me singing in your ear would be slightly more disturbing. Let's see who's on. Let me go to all of my wonderful Discords and let them know, hey, that weird guy is about to start telling stories. Nope. Because stories is what I do. I like telling stories. Excuse me. So hurts. Oh, ding. Oh, good. Stream Elements actually posted the right message for once. Isn't that just amazing? Isn't she one? Yeah. 2 Discords posted too. Okay. Streaming booth. Self-promo. I am horrible at self-promotion. In case people haven't figured that out by now. Dun, 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 dun. Da, 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 da. Is it sure? Stream link. There's. That's not that much earlier. I started maybe 5 minutes earlier than I usually do. It's gotten to where I have to start earlier just so I can get all the Discord stuff taken care of. Yeah, that's how my schedule is. That's 9 Central to 11 Central for me, so. And time zones are a pain in the ass anyway. I'm still working on the cough syrup. I mean, most of the people that follow me that say they would really want to listen to me, it would be 4 a.m. for them right now. Well, maybe not 4 a.m. They're 6 hours ahead, so that would put them. No, 4 a.m. I've just been having coughing issues for the past week or so. Of course, I've been living under constant air conditioner, so that's probably not helping much. Of course, I'm also adding cough syrup to wine. I don't think that's going to help much, is it? I don't know. The cough syrup says it's not alcoholic, so being in wine should be fine. See, the only problem with me using chapstick is my cat likes to be in my face constantly, and it would just be coated in hair. I've had that issue before. It's hard not to have dry air. I live in the freaking Texas Panhandle. Yeah. Why am I so small on the screen? Yeah. I mean, if the fur that was on my lips was mine, it probably wouldn't bother me nearly as much. Why am I so small on the screen? Make my normal size. There we go. Fade across. There we go. Uh, no problem. Even if I'm lurking, I try to be there. Of course, it's interesting hearing the conversations between you and the kids, so. So are you still having problems with OBS doing the switchover? Or? Let me just trying to stretch my neck makes my whole body tingle. Yeah. Yeah. See, the mirroring seems to work the best because even when I'm doing video games, I do it as a remote play to them. That works better. I mean, if it'll work one way, it'll work the other. Okay, why didn't it shout you out when you came in? It's supposed to be slacking off on the job again. That supposed is on. I've got it. On Fosabot, you can set it up to do keyword. Let's see, keywords. Da, 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 da. Oh, I'm gonna get you on here. Hmm. Pretty sure I got you on here. Yeah, Thompson. Hmm. That is weird. Don't have any timeouts on it. Because it should do the shout out as soon as your name pops up in the screen. And I could like post your name right now and well, my keyboard will cooperate. Because it should be as soon as it pops up, it's supposed to auto do like that. Yeah, I haven't figured out how to do the clip shout out yet. Of course, someone does a shout out on me, it'll probably end up being like reading the presidential oath or something. It shouldn't be. I said I just put your login. Hmm. Well, I've only got it set to do it like once every 5 hours. Turn that off real quick. Nor cooldowns. Okay. Boom. Yep, there it goes. So it's working. It's supposed to be able to do it like on your first post. Weird. It's like the first. Oh yeah, Fosabot's been a pain anyway. And there's some that I went ahead and programmed personalized ones, and where I think I set it up to auto shout out like my first 100 followers. And then when I had time, I started going back through and doing the customized shout outs. With you narrating, yeah, I saw that one. Hmm. What is a Celica? I've never seen half these Pokemon that have been showing up in my system. Let's see. Is my camera watching my eyes? Nope, yeah, there it goes. Yeah. I'm going to try to get through 3 stories tonight. Okay, somehow my coughing has gotten more annoying after the cough syrup. Let's see, I don't have the auto blink set up, but I've got. I also have both the light from my phone and the lamp nearby blinding me. Ugh. Yeah, because I saw you were using the. Where's it? You were using the cat. Kitty kitty. Ow! Okay, back to me. I'm using VTube Studio. Of course, I've got another model that I won, which I'm going to use uh, when I start doing like regular scary stories next month. But it makes me so cute. I don't know if I have it set up wrong or what, but it's one of the things I'll have to work on. Yeah, Duskwalker made the chibi model for me. But I'm going to do that when I start doing the scarier campfire stories, just because I felt like it. As I was going to, where's it? Okay. Yeah, I haven't finished doing all the editing yet. And I really need to fix my animations on this. But I was going to go through and add a little campfire on here. And then I was going to tell the scary stories by the campfire because, well, and my animations are a little shoddy, but I was just testing it, so. Of course, have you been here for one of the? Well, I've only had one Frankenstein night so far. That was last week, but I did this for Frankenstein. Yes, and Wednesdays I'm trying to read Well, not Wednesdays. Thursdays I'm trying to read Frankenstein, so I can keep the fairy tales on Friday. But I finally got around to doing my backdrop on here, and got my Grimm Brothers desk finished. But if you, where's it? When I premiered it the last week, I did a whole setup for doing the Frankenstein stuff, and yeah, there's a video. It is. When I did my Frankenstein video last week, I started off with doing my usual introduction and all that fun stuff. Then I switched over to my regular PG story time. Then I switched to the horror story time. Then I blacked out, and then I pulled the everything back up into the laboratory because I'm just weird. But yeah, if I can get around to it, and I'll get my forest edited better and do better animations on the ghosts and creepy crawlies in the background. Then I'll edit the campfire because it looks like I'm going to have to assemble edit that anyway. And that's just PNG editing. Well, not PNG editing, it's GIF editing, which I've done that several times before. Eventually, I was going to put like candles on my desk in here, but just haven't gotten to it because I'm a bit lazy. So, what model were you looking at? mean, depending on what kind of model you want, I know a few people who do fairly decent ones. Little black and red cat ghost. Well, you may, depending on how detailed you want it. The person who did my model was pretty good, and both of my models were both made and uh, I forgot the term. Oh. But it's like the person who did this model also did the rigging for it, and the person who did my chibi model did the rigging for that model. This one was done by FanArtsy, and the chibi was done by Duskwalker. Let's see. I haven't checked what FanArtsy's prices are right now, but it was just going to be. Oh, 2D Mimic Demon? That'd be cute. Now, FanArtsy does fantasy and furries, so she did mine. Let's see. I don't know what her prices are right now. Let me look. Live 2D. Well, she has gone up a lot. Now she's up to 1,000 euros. Damn. This is one of the reasons I am glad I am friends with the artists. Because my model was an experiment. So FanArtsy only charged me like 150. Well, she was gonna say pay what I could. I paid her 150 because that's what I had. Ooh, freaky wide smile. Oh, that would be fun to watch. Mouthful of sharp teeth. But it's like I don't have any pre-saved expressions on mine. I don't have a cat on sleep on my foot. Nope. Do something I thought was interesting to find out I could do in here. Where am I? Oh, there I am. No, no, no. Stop that. Get over there. You're supposed to be small. You're supposed to be bigger. I can go over there. Can I even see over my desk? Just barely. Yeah, I really like the chibi model. Can't wait until I start officially using it. But the fact that I can use both at the same time, it's that's one of the funs you can do on Studio. Back up there. Desk. Yeah, I thought I was gonna start up doing the campfire stories. I was going to set it up like be in here and start talking about how I do the stories and start talking about, oh yeah, I remember way back when I was a cub, and then switch to the forest. Oh, where'd you go? Where's my forest? Oh, spooky forest. There we go. That one. Then I was just gonna have the cub take over from here and tell all the stories. But anyway, go away. But again, that's future plans. And since on the OBS you can set it up to do it as a separate window, I would literally just crossfade into the other story. So it'd be fun when I get to it. I'm just glad I found my book of stories for that one. I do wish my mouth were a little bit more animated. Yeah. But yeah. It's strange that I'll make plans and then I'll do some big event setup on it and then no one shows up. I could. Uh, it would just look funny if I was always open mouthed. Let's see. No, not that. Come here. No, not mouse input. Mouth open sensitivity, crank it up. Smile sensitivity, crank it up. Brow sensitivity, eye open, blink. Yeah. Okay. As it is, I'm using my phone as my camera. Because my laptop's camera isn't all that great, but I can transmit from my phone and do it directly that way. As long as I have the server set up on there, it'll connect it. I usually try using the microphone. Ah, microphone. Ah, ah. But even then, it doesn't do it very well. Ah. Whereas just a regular phone camera phone, it seems to work a little bit better. At least it's supposed to. Figure out what's going on here. What's bad is it looks better on my phone than it does on the stream. But hopefully after this weekend, it'll improve a little. I'm going to try to see if I can upgrade my RAM a little. And that way... okay. But yeah. I'm going to try to do a RAM upgrade. And hopefully then my computer will be able to handle a little bit more, because doing all of this with my 16 gig of RAM may be trying to kill it. So... yeah. What does this have? 3 people? Do I have 3 people? Ah, I see who be lurking. Hello, lurkers. Nice to not see you. Anyway, I guess I really should start the stories. Man. It's not the cough medicine, it's the wine. Yeah. One of the things I've started doing on the announcements is I'll put the first line from the story. And the first line of the story is several large lizards were running nimbly in and out. So, the first story for tonight is Elfin-Mound, which would explain why it's lizards. So, several large lizards were running nimbly in and out among the clefts of an old tree. They could understand each other perfectly well, for they spoke all the lizards' language. Only hear what a rumbling and grumbling there is in the old Elfin-Mound yonder, observed one lizard. I have not been able to close my eyes for the past 2 nights. I might as well have had a toothache for the sleep I have had. There is something in the wind, most certainly, rejoined the second lizard. They raise the mount upon 4 red pillars till cock-crowing. There is a regular cleaning and dusting going on, and the elven maidens are learning new dances. Such a stamping they make in them. There is certainly something in the wind. On the wind. Yes, I've been talking it over with the earthworm of my acquaintance, said the third lizard. The earthworm has just come from the mount. He has been grubbing in the ground for days and nights together, and has overheard a good deal. He can't see it all, poor wretch, but no one can be quicker than he is at feeling and hearing. They're expecting strangers at the Elfin-Mound, distinguished strangers. But who they are, the earthworm could not say. Most likely, he did not know. All the will-o'-the-wisps are engaged to form a procession of torches, so they call it, And all the silver and gold, of which there is such store in the Elfin-Mound, is being fresh rubbed up and set out to shine in the moonlight. But who can these strangers be? Exclaimed all the lizards with one voice. What can be in the wind? Only listen, what buzzing and humming! Just then the Elfin-Mound parted asunder, and an elderly elven damsel came tripping out. She was the old Elfin King's housekeeper, and distantly related to his family, on which account she wore an amber heart on her forehead, but was otherwise plainly dressed. Like all other elves, she was hollow in the back. She was quick and light-footed. Trip, 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 she ran away straight into the marsh to the night raven. You are invited to Elfin-Mound for this very evening, she said. But will you not first do us a very great kindness, and be the bearer of the other invitations? Do you not keep house yourself, you know? You so easily oblige us. We are expecting some very distinguished strangers, trolls in fact, and his elfin majesty intends to welcome them in person. Who are to be invited? Inquired the night raven. Why, to the grand ball all the world may come, even men, if they could but talk in their sleep, or do a little but anything in our way. But the first banquet must be very select. None but the guests of the very highest rank must be present. And to say the truth, I and the king have been having a little dispute, for I insist that not even ghosts may be admitted tonight. The Mer-King and his daughters must be invited first. They don't much like coming on land, but I'll promise they shall have a wet stone, or perhaps something better still, to sit on. And then I think they cannot possibly refuse us this time. To the trolls, the riverbank we must have. Also the river spirit and his nisses. And, I fancy we cannot pass over the death horse and the king groom. True, they do not belong to our set. They're too solemn for us. But they are connected with the family, and pay regular visits. Ka! Said the night raven, and away he flew to bear the invitations. The elven maidens were still dancing in the Elfin-Mound. They danced with long scarves woven from mist and moonlight, and for those who like that sort of thing, it looks pretty enough. The large stateroom in the mount had been regularly cleaned and cleared out. The floor had been washed with moonshine, and the walls rubbed with witches' fat till they shone as tulips do when they open up in the light. In the kitchen, frogs were roasting on the spit, while divers other choice dishes, such as mushroom seed, hemlock soup, etc., were being preparing. These were to supply the first courses. Rusty nails, bits of colored glass, and such like dainties were to come in for the dessert. There was also a bright saltpeter wine, and ale brewed in the brewery of the wise witch of the moor. Tasty. The old Elven King's gold crown had been fresh rubbed and powdered with slate pencil. New curtains had been hung up in all the sleeping rooms. Yes, there was indeed a rare bustle and commotion. Now we must have the rooms scented with cows' hairs and swine's bristles, and then I think I shall have done my part, said the Elven King's housekeeper. Poor papa, said the youngest of the daughters. Won't you tell me now who these grand visitors are? Well, replied his majesty, I suppose there's no use in keeping it a secret. Let two of my daughters get themselves ready for their wedding day. That's all. Two of them most certainly will be married. The chief of the Norwegian trolls, who dwells in the old Dorefeld, and has so many castles of free stone among these rocky fastnesses, besides a gold mine. which is a capital thing, let me tell you. He is coming down here with his two boys, who are both to choose themselves a bride. Such an honest, straightforward, true old Norseman and his mountain chief. So merry and jovial. He and I are old comrades, and we came down here years ago to fetch his wife. She's dead now. She was the daughter of the Rock King at Moen. Oh, how I long to see the old Norseman again. His sons, they say, are rough, mannerly cubs, but perhaps report may have done them some injustice, and at any rate they're sure to improve in a year or two, when they have sown their wild oats. Let me see how you will polish them up. Huh. And how soon are they to be here? Inquired the youngest daughter again. That depends on wind and weather, returned the Elfin King. They travel economically. They come at the ship's convenience. I wanted them to pass over by Sweden, but the old man would not hear of that. He does not keep pace with the times. That's the only fault I can find in him. Just then two will-o'-the-wisps were seen dancing up in a vast hurry, each trying to get before the other, and to be the first to bring the news. They come! They come! Both cried in one voice. Bring me my crown, and let me stand in the moonlight, said the Elfin King. And his 7 daughters lifted their long scarves and bowed low to the earth. There stood the Troll chief from Dorfelfeld, wearing a crown composed of icicles and polished pine cones. For the rest, he was equipped in a bearskin cloak and sledge boots. His sons were clad more slightly and kept their throats uncovered, by way of showing that they cared nothing about the cold. Is that the mount? Asked the youngest of them, pointing it out. Why, up in the north we should have called it a cave. You foolish boy, replied his father. A cave you go into, a mount you go up to. Where are your eyes, not to see the difference? The only thing that surprised them in this country, they said, was that the people should speak and understand their language. Behave yourselves now, said the old man. Don't let your host fancy you never went to decent company before. And now they all entered the Elfin-Mound, into the grand salon, where a really very select party was assembled, although at such short notice that it seemed almost as though some fortunate gust of wind might have blown them together. And every possible arrangement had been made for the comfort of each of the guests. The Mer-King's family, for instance, sat at a table in large tubs of water, where they declared they felt quite as if they were at home. They behaved with strict good breeding, except the 2 northern trolls, who at last so far forgot themselves as to put their legs on the table. Such manners. Take your legs away from the plates, said their father, and they obeyed, but not so readily that they might have done. Presently they took some pine cones out of their pockets and began pelting the lady who sat between them. And then, finding that their boots incommode them, they took them off and coolly gave them to the lady to hold. But their father, the old mountain chief, conducted himself very differently. He talked so delightfully about the proud Norse mountains, and the torrents, white with dancing spray, that dashed foaming down their rocky steep, with a noise loud and hoarse as thunder, yet musical as the full burst of an organ, touched by a master hand. He told of the salmon leaping up from the wild waters while the neck was playing on his golden harp. He told of the starlight winter nights when the sledge bells tinkled so merrily, and the youths ran with lighted torches over the icy crust, so glassy and transparent that though it were to see the fishes whirling to and fro in the deadly terror beneath their feet. He told of the gallant northern youths, pretty maidens singing songs of old time, and dancing the Heligent's dance. Yes, so charmingly he described this all. You could not but fancy you heard it and saw it all. Oh, fie, for shame! All of a sudden the mountain chief turned upon the elderly elven maiden, and gave her a cousinly salute, and he was not yet connected ever so remotely with the family. The young elven maidens were now called upon to dance. First they danced simple steps, then stamping dances, and then they did both remarkably well. Last came the most difficult of all, the dance out of the dance, as it was called. Bravo! How long their legs seemed to grow, and how they whirled and spun about. You could hardly distinguish legs from arms or arms from legs. Round and round they went, such whirling and twirling, such whirring and whizzing that they had made the death horse feel quite dizzy. And at last he grew so unwell that he was obliged to leave the table. "Hurrah!" cried the mountain chief. "They know how to use their limbs with a vengeance. But can they do nothing else than dance? Stretch out their feet and spin around like a whirlwind?" "Oh, shall judge yourself," replied the Elven King. And here he called the oldest of the daughters to him. She was transparent and fair as moonlight. She was, in fact, the most delicate of all the sisters. She put a white wand between her lips and vanished. That was her accomplishment. But the mountain chief said he could not at all like his wife to possess such an accomplishment as this, and he did not think his sons would like it either. Who would want their wife to just disappear at random? The second walked by the side of herself, just as though she had a shadow, which elves and trolls never have. The accomplishment of the third sister was quite another kind. She had learned how to brew good ale from the wise witch of the moor, and she also knew how to hard alder woods and worm with glowworms. "She will make a capital housewife," remarked the old mountain chief. And now advanced the fourth elven damsel. She carried a large gold harp, and no sooner had she struck the first chord than all the company lifted to their feet, for elves are left-sided, and when she struck the second chord, they were all compelled to do whatever she wished. "A dangerous lady indeed," said the old troll chief. Both of his sons now got up and strode out to the mount. They were heartily weary of these accomplishments. "And what can the next daughter do?" asked the mountain chief. "I have learned to love the north," replied she, "and I have resolved never to marry unless I may go to Norway." But the youngest of the sisters whispered to the old man, "That is only because ye heard an old Norse rhyme, which says that when the end of the world shall come, the Norwegian rocks shall stand firm amid the ruins. She is very much afraid of death, and therefore she wants to go to Norway." Nice to see you come in, Altered. What was it? "Ho, ho!" cried the mountain chief. "Sits the wind in that quarter? And what can the seventh and last do?" "The sixth come before the seventh," said the Elfin King, for he could count better than to make such a mistake. However, the sixth seemed in no hurry to come forward. "I can only tell people the truth," she said. Let no one trouble himself about me. I have enough to do to sew my shroud. And now came the seventh and last. And what could she do? Why, she could tell fairy tales, as many as one could wish for. Here are my 5 fingers, said the mountain chief. Tell me a story for each finger. And the elfin maid took hold of his wrist and told her stories. He laughed till his sides ached, and when she came to the finger that wore a gold ring, as though she knew it might be wanted, the mountain king suddenly exclaimed, Hold fast what thou hast. The hand is mine. I shall have thee myself to wife. But the elven maiden said that she still had 2 more stories to tell, one for the ring finger and one for the little finger. Keep them for next winter. We'll hear them then, replied the mountain chief. And we'll hear about the lovers of the fir tree and the birch. About the Valkyria's gifts, too, for we all love fairy legends in Norway, and no one there can tell them so charmingly as thou dost. And then we will sit in our rocky hills, whilst the fir logs are blazing and crackling in the stove, and drink mead out of golden horns of the Norse kings. The Neck has taught me a few of his rare ditties. Besides, the Garbo will come often and pay us a visit, and he will sing thee all the sweet songs that the mountain maidens sang in the days of yore. That will be most delightful. The salmon in the torrent will spring up and beat himself against the rock walls, but in vain he will not be able to get in. Oh, thou canst imagine what a happy, glorious life we will lead in my dear old Norway. But where are the boys? Where were the boys? Why, they were racing about in the fields, blowing out all the poor will-o'-the-wisps, who were just ranging themselves in a proper order to make a procession of torches. What do you mean by making all this riot? Inquired the mountain chief. I have been choosing you a mother, and now you come and choose yourselves wives from among your aunts. Oh, yeah. But his sons said they would rather make speeches and drink toasts. They had not the slightest wish to marry. Accordingly, they made speeches and tossed off their glasses and turned them topsy-turvy on the table to show that they were quite empty. After this, they took off their coats and most unceremoniously lay down on the table and went to sleep. But the old mountain chief, the while, danced around the hall with his young bride and exchanged boots with her, because it is not so vulgar as exchanging rings. Listen, the cock is crowing, exclaimed the lady housekeeper. We must haste and shut the window shutters close, or the sun will scorch our complexions. And herewith Elfin-Mound closed. But outside the cloven trunk the lizards kept running up and down, and one and all declared, What a capital fellow that old Norwegian troll is! For my part, I prefer the boys, said the earthworm. But he, poor wretch, could see nothing either of them or their father, so his opinion was not worth much. Poor earthworm. Yay, people! Hope everyone's having a good night. And my next story is The Marsh King's Daughter. That's always good resting and relaxing, especially on a Friday night. Doesn't happen often enough. The storks tell their young ones every so many fairy tales, and some of them are from the fen and the moss. Generally, the tales are suited to the youngsters' age and understanding. The baby birds are pleased if they are told just cribbly, crabbly, pretty, merly, which they think wonderful. But the older ones have something with more sense to it, or at the least a tale about themselves. Of the two oldest and longest tales which have been told among the storks, one we know, that of Moses, who was placed by his mother in an ark on the waters of the Nile, was found by the fatherless king, then was taught all learning and become a great man, and no one knows where he was buried. Everyone has heard that tale. But the other story is known, or not known at all, even now. Perhaps because it is really a chimney corner tale. It has been handed down by mother stork to mother stork for hundreds of years, and each in turn has told it better, till now we are all telling it best of all. The first pair of storks who knew it had the summer quarters of the Vikings' longhouse by the moor in the Westland, which is in the country of Horig, near Scotland and Jutland, if we want to be accurate. To this day, there is still an enormous great moss there. You can read all about it in your geography book. The moss lies where was once the bottom of the sea before the great upheaval of the land, and now it stretches for miles, surrounded on all sides by watery meadows and quivering bogs, with turf moss, cloudberries, and stunted growing trees. A fog hangs over it almost continually, and until about 70 years ago, wolves were still found there. Well, they're back, but still. It may certainly be called Wildmoor, and you can imagine what lack of paths and what abundance of swamp and sea was there thousands of years ago. It was a waste man saw ages back, just what he sees today. The reeds were just as high, with the same kind of long leaves, and purplish brown, feathery flowers, just as they have now. The birches stood with white bark and fine, loose hung leaves, just as they now stand. And for the living creatures that came there, why, the fly wore its gauze suit of just the same cut as now, and the color of the stork's dress was white and black with red stockings. On the other hand, the men of that time wore different clothes from those we wear now. But whoever it was, poor peasants or free hunter, that trod in the quagmire, it happened thousands of years ago just as it does today. And he went, he sank, down to the Marsh King, as they called him, who reigned beneath the great Moss Kingdom. He was called the Mire King, but we will call him by the stork's name for him, Marsh King. People know very little about how he governed, but perhaps that is just as well. Near to the moss and right to the Limfjord stood the Viking's longhouse, with a paved cellar and tower 2 stories high. On the roof, the storks had built their nest. Mother stork sat on her eggs, and was positive they would turn out well. One evening, Father Stork had been out for a long time, and when he came home he seemed excited and flurried. "I have dreadful news for you," he said to Mother Stork. "Don't get excited," said she. "Remember, I'm sitting on my eggs, and I might be upset by it, and then the eggs would suffer." "You must know," he answered. "She has come here, our landlord's daughter in Egypt." She has ventured on the journey here, and she is lost. Why? She is of fairy descent. Tell me all about it. You know I can't bear to wait at this time, when I'm sitting. Listen, Mother, it's as I have told you. She has believed what the doctor says, that the moorflowers here could do her sick father good. So she has flown here in her feather dress and with other winged princesses, who have come to the north every year to bathe and renew their youth. She has come, and she is lost. You're getting too long-winded, said the mother stork. The eggs may be chilled. I can't bear to be this excited. I have watched, said the father stork, and in the evening, when I went to the reeds, where the quagmire is able to bear me, there came 3 swans. Something in the way they flew told me, watch, that isn't a real swan, it's only swan feathers. You know the feeling, Mother, as well as I do. You can tell if it is right. Yes, certainly, she said. But tell me about the princess. I'm tired of hearing about the swan's feathers. Here in the middle of the moor, you know, said Father Stork, is a kind of lake. You can see part of it when you stand up. There, by the reeds and the green quagmire, lies a great elder stump. The 3 swans lighted on it, flapped their wings, and looked around them. Then one of them threw off her swan's plumage, and I saw it was our princess from our house in Egypt. Then she sat down, and she had no other covering other than her own long black hair. Wow. I heard her ask the 2 others to take great care of her swanskin while she plunged under the water to gather a flower, which she thought she saw. They nodded and lifted up the loose feather dress. I wonder what they mean to do with it, said I to myself, and no doubt she asked them the same. And she got an answer, something she could see herself. They threw aloft the feather dress. Sink down, they cried. You shall never fly in the swan skin again. Never in Egypt again. Stay in the moss. And so they tore the feather dress into 100 pieces, till the feathers flew about as if it were snowing, and off the 2 good-for-nothing princesses flew. Wow. Oh, how dreadful, said Mother Stork. I can't bear to hear it, but tell me, what else happened? Our princess moaned and wept. Her tears fell on the elder stump, and it was quite moved, for it was the Marsh King himself who lives in the quagmire. I saw the stump turn itself, so it wasn't only a trunk, for it put out long muddy boughs like arms, and even then the unhappy girl was frightened, and sprang aside into the quivering marsh, which will not bear me, much less her. And at once she sank. Down went her with the elder stump. It was he who pulled her down, the few big black bubbles, and no trace left of her. She was engulfed in the marsh, and will never return to Egypt with her flower. You couldn't have borne to see it, Mother. You shouldn't have told me anything of the sort just now. It may affect the eggs. The princess can take good care of herself. She'll get help easily enough. Had it been you or I, there would have been an end to us. However, I'll go on to say later to see about it, said Father Stork, and so he did. The days and months went by. He saw the last one day right from the bottom of the marsh. A green stalk pushed up till it reached the surface of the water. Out of it grew a leaf, and that grew wider and wider, and the bud on it put out. Then one morning, as the stork was flying over it, it opened, with the sun's warmth until a full-blown flower in the middle of which lay a beautiful child, a little girl, and if she were fresh from the bath, so like was the child to the princess of Egypt, that at first the stork believed it was her turned child again. But when he thought it over, he decided that it was more likely the child of the princess and the Marsh king, and that she was lying in a water lily. She mustn't be left lying there, thought Father Stork. There are too many already in my nest. But I have it. The Viking's wife have no children. She has often wished for a little one. Yes, I'll get the name for bringing the babies. I will do it in sober truth at once. I'll fly to the Viking's wife with the child. They'll be so delighted. Okay, that leads to why storks are known for delivering babies. Kind of cool. Anyway, so the stork took the little girl and flew to the log house, made a hole with his beak in the window with the panes made of a bladder, laid the child in the bosom of the Viking's wife, and flew away to Mother Stork to tell her all about it. Her young ones heard it too, for they were now old enough. Listen, the princess is not dead. She sent her little one up, and the child has a home found for her. Yes, so I said from the first, said Mother Stork. Now think about your own little children. It's almost time for our journey. I begin to feel a tingling under my wings. The cuckoo and the nightingale are already off, and I hear quails chattering about it, and saying that we shall soon have a favorable wind. Our young ones are quite fit for the training, I'm sure. Glad indeed was the Viking's wife when she woke in the morning to find a little child near her side. She kissed and fondled it, but it was screaming with passion, and threw out its arms and legs, and seemed utterly miserable. At last it cried itself to sleep, and there it lay, one of the prettiest babies you could ever set eyes upon. The Viking's wife was so happy, so gay, so well, that she could not but hope that her husband and his men would return as suddenly as the little one had come. And so she and all the household busied themselves to get everything into order. The long colored tapestries, which she and her maidens had woven with figures of their gods, Odin, Thor, Freya, as they were called, were hung up. The slaves were set to polish the old shields and use as decorations. Cushions were arranged on benches and dry wood placed on the hearth in the middle of the hall, so that the fire could be lit in a moment. The Viking's wife took her share of the work, so that by evening she was very tired and slept soundly. When she woke afterwards, towards daybreak, she was terribly frightened. The little child had vanished. She sprang up, lighted a brand, and looked everywhere around. There, just at the foot of the bed, was where she had lain. Was not the baby, but a great, ugly toad. In utter disgust at it, she took a very heavy stick to kill it. But the creature looked at her with such wonderfully sad eyes that she could not destroy it. Once more she gazed around. The toad uttered a faint, mournful croak. She started and sprang from the bed to the windows and opened it. At that moment the sun rose, and it cast rays upon the bed and upon the great toad. All at once it seemed that the creature's wide mouth shrank and became small and rosy. The limbs filled out into the most charming shape. It was her own beautiful babe that lay there, not the hideous reptile. Fiona. Interesting. But I once shared the day the other. Cool. What is this? Cried the dame. Was it an ill dream? Yes, there is my own sweet elfin child lying there. She kissed it and pressed it to her heart, but it fought and bit like a wild kitten, as kids do. The Viking, however, did not come that day, nor the next, for though he was on his way, the wind was against him, as for it blew to the south for the storks. Fair wind is a foul one for another. Those 2 days and nights the Viking wife saw clearly how it was with her little child, and dreadful indeed was the spell that lay upon it. By day it was as beautiful as an angel of light, but it had a bad, evil disposition. By night, on the other hand, it was a hideous toad, quiet, sad, with sorrowful eyes. It had two natures, which changed with its outward form. And so it was that the baby, brought by the stork, had by daylight its mother's own rightful shape, but its father's temper, while again night made the kinship with him evidence in the bodily form, in which, however, dwelt the mother's mind and heart. Who could choose the spell cast by the power of witchcraft? The Viking's wife was worn and distressed about it, and her heart was heavy for the unhappy being, whose condition she did not think that she dared to tell her husband if he came home then, for he would certainly follow the custom and practice of the time, and expose the poor child on the high road for anyone that liked to take it away. The good dame had not the heart to do this. Her husband should see the child only by daylight. One morning the wings of storks were heard above the roof. More than 100 pair of the birds had rested themselves for the night after their heavy exercise, and they now flew up preparatory to starting southwards. "Already, the wives and the children?" was their cry. "Oh, I'm so light," said the young storks. "My bones feel all cribbly-crabbly, as if I was filled with live frogs. How splendid it is to have to go abroad!" "Keep up in the flight," said the father and the mother, "and don't chatter so much. It tires the chest." And they flew. At the same moment the horn sounded over the moor. The Viking had landed with all his men, returning laden with booty from the coasts of Gaul, where the people, like those of Britain, used to chant in their terror, "From the rage of the Northern, Lord deliver us." Guess what stir and festival now came to the Viking stronghold near the moor? A barrel of mead was brought into the hall. A huge fire was lighted. Horses were slaughtered. Everything went duly. The heathen priests sprinkled the slaves with warm blood and began their new life. The fire crackled. The smoke curled under the roof. The soot fell down from the beams. They were so used to that. Guests were invited and received valuable gifts. Plots and treachery were forgotten. They drank deep and threw the picked bones into each other's faces in good-humored horseplay. The bard, a kind of musician, but a warrior as well, who went with them, saw their exploits and sang about them, gave them a song in which they heard all their warrior deeds and feats of prowess. Each verse ended with a refrain: "Wealth, kindred, life cannot endure, but the warrior's glory standeth sure." Should really not sing these things, but oh well. And they all crashed upon their shields, and beat upon the table with knives and fists, and made great clamor. Because Vikings party, yo. The Viking's wife sat on the crossbench in the open banquet hall. She wore a robe of silk, with bracelets of gold and beads of amber. She had put on her dress of state, and the bard sang of her, and told of the golden treasures she had brought to her wealthy lord. while he was delighted with the beautiful child, for he could see it by day in all its loveliness. He was well pleased with his baby's wildness, and said she would become a right warrior maid, and fight as his champion. She did not even blink her eyes when a skillful hand cut her eyelashes with a sharp sword as a rough joke. Damn, brave kid. The barrel of mead was drained, and a second brought in, and all got well drunk, for they were folk who loved to drink their fill. They have a proverb: the kind know when we shall stall from pasture, but the fool never knows when he has had enough. I like that. They knew it well enough, but now and do are different things. They had another proverb, too. The dearest friend grows wearisome when he outstays his welcome. Yep. But on they stayed. Meat and mead was good. It was glorious. And the slaves slept in warm ashes, and dipped their fingers in the fat and licked them. Oh, it was a great time. Once again that year the Viking raid went on. Through the autumn gales were rising. He led his men to the coast of Britain. Just over the water, he said, and his wife remained with the little girl. And, truth to tell, the foster mother soon grew fonder of the unhappy toad with its gentle eyes, deep sigh than the beautiful child that fought and bit about her. The raw, dank autumn mist, mouthless, which devours the leaves which lay over the forest and moor, bird featherless, as they now called the snow, which flew closely all around. Winter was nigh at hand. The sparrows took the storks' nests for themselves, and criticized the ways of their late owners during the absence. And where were mother and father stork and their young ones all this time? Down in the land of Egypt, where the sun shone warm, as it does on a fine summer's day with us. Tamarinds and acacias bloomed around them, and the crescents of Mahomet's gleamed bright from the cupolas in the mosques. Pairs and pairs of storks sat on slender turrets and rested after the long journey. Great flocks of them had built their nest by nest on huge pillars and broken arches of temples and forgotten cities. The date palm raised its foliage high as if to keep off the glare of the sun. Gray white pyramids stood out amongst the clear sky across the desert, where the ostrich raced at speed, and the lion crouched with wise, great eyes, and saw a marble sphinx lay half buried in the sand. The Nile flood had retired, and the whole bed of the river was swarming with frogs, and, to a stork family, that was quite the best thing to be seen in the country. The young ones thought their eyes must be playing them tricks. It all seemed so wonderful. We always have it just like this in our warm countries, said the mother stork, and the young ones felt their appetites grow. Will there be any more to see? They said. Shall we go much farther into the country? There's nothing greater to see, said Mother Stork. At that green border is only wild wood, where the trees crowd upon each other, and are entangled together with thorny creepers. Only an elephant with its clumsy legs can make a way there. The snakes are too large for us, and the lizards too lively. If you try to go into the desert, you will get your eyes full of sand in fair weather, and if there is much wind, you'll find yourself buried under a sand heap. No, this is the best place. Here, frogs and locusts. I shall stop here, and you must stay with me. And they stayed. The old ones sat in their nests on the splendor mats and rested themselves, while yet they were busy preening their feathers and rubbing their beaks on their red stocking legs. They would raise their necks, bow gravely, and hold on their heads with their high foreheads, fine, smooth feathers, and brown eyes glancing sharply. Young hen storks walked gravely among the coarse reeds, stealing glances at the other young storks and devouring a frog at every third step. There was a small snake, which they found so good for their health and so tasty. The young males began to quarrel and beat each other with their wings, pecked, yes, stabbed till blood flowed. And so one another got betrothed, and that was the whole purpose of their life. They built nests, and from that sprang new quarrels, for the hot country's tempers are so quick. Nevertheless, it was delightful, especially to the old ones. Everyone there owns youngsters to become themselves. Every day there was sunshine. Every day there was so much taken up with eating that there was hardly time to think of other amusement. Hmm. But inside the rich palace of their Egyptian landlord, as they called him, joy was unknown. Rich and mighty lord, there he lay on a couch, his limbs rigid, stretched out like a mummy, in the midst of the great hall with its many-colored walls. It looked as if he was lying in a tulip. His kinsmen and servants stood around him. He was not dead. You could not call him alive. He existed. The healing moss flower from the northern land, which should have been searched for and gathered by her who loved him so dearly, would never be brought. His young and beautiful daughter, who swam in the swan's plumage over the sea and land, far towards the north, would never return. She is dead and gone, the two swan maidens had told him in their return. They had invented a whole history of it, said they. We all three flew high in the air. A hunter saw us and shot an arrow. It struck our friend, and singing her farewell, like a dying swan, she sank slowly in the midst of a forest lake. There we buried her, near the shore of the lake, under a fragrant weeping birch. But we took our revenge. We bound fire under the wings of the swallow which had built under the hunter's thatched roof. The thatch caught, and the house blazed up. He burned in it, and the light shone over the lake so far as the drooping birch tree under which she is buried. She will never come back to the land of Egypt. Yes. And so they both wept, and the father stork, when he heard it, chattered his beak till it rattled again. Lies and make-up, he said. I have a great mind to drive my beak into their hearts. And break it off, said the mother stork. And what good would it do? Think first of yourself and of your own family. Everything else is of no consequence. However, I will seat myself on the edge of the open court in the morning. When all the learned doctors are met to talk the truth of illness, perhaps I will come a little nearer to the truth. And the learned doctors came together and talked all about, so that the stork could make head or tail of it. Nor did he do anything come of it for sickness for the daughter in his more. But nevertheless, we shall be glad to hear something about it, for we are obliged to listen to a great deal. But now it will be a very good thing to learn what had gone on before this meeting, in order to understand this story better, for at least we know how much the father stork knew. Love brings life. The highest love supports the highest life. Only through love will he be able to secure the preservation of his life. And that is what they said, and very wisely and well said it was, according to the legend. That's a pretty thought, said Father Stork. I don't rightly understand it, said Mother Stork, and it isn't my fault, but the expressions, however, be that as may, it's something I have else to think about. Then the learned men had spoken of love for one thing to another, of the difference there is between the affection of lovers and that of a parent and child. of the love of a plant in a sunbeam, where the rays of the sun touch the bud and the young shoot thus comes forth. All of this was expounded at such great length and in a learned way that it was impossible for Father Stork to follow it, much less to repeat it. He was quite thoughtful about it, and half closed his eyes and stood on one leg the whole day afterwards. Such learning was too heavy for him to bear. However, he understood one thing. He had heard that both the common folk and those of the highest rank say the same thing from the bottom of their hearts. That it was a great misfortune for thousands of people, for the country at large, that this man should be ill and not recover. It would be a joy and a blessing if he were restored to health. But where does the flower of health grow for him? That was what they all inquired. They sought it from the scrolls of wisdom, from the twinkling stars, and from the winds. They had asked in all byways where they might find it, and at last learned the wise announcement, and we have said, "Love brings forth life, the life of a father." And so they said more than they themselves understood. They repeated it, and wrote it as a prescription. Love brings forth life. But how was the thing to be done from this prescription? Here lay the difficulty. At length they came to agreement about it. The help must come from the princess, who was attached to her father with her whole heart and soul. And then they decided how it was to be brought about. All this was more than a year and a day before. She must go by night, at the new moon, to the marble sphinx near the desert. She must clear away the sand from the door with her feet, and then go through the long passage that led to the middle of one of the great pyramids, wherein his mummy case lay one of the mighty kings of old, surrounded by splendor and magnificence. Here she was to hold her ear to the lips of the dead, and then it would be revealed to her how she was to gain life and health from her father. Oh yeah, easy. All this she had done, and had learned and visioned that from the deep marsh in the land of Denmark, a spot most clearly indicated, she might bring home the marsh flower, which there in the depth of the water had touched her breast. Then he would be healed. So she flew in the swan's plumage from the land of Egypt to the moor. You see, Father Stork and Mother Stork were aware of this, and now we know the story more fully than before. We remember that the Marsh King dragged her down to him. We know that those at home that she is dead and gone, while the wisest of them, and still with Mother Stork, she takes good care of herself. And they were obligated to wait, and for that was all they knew about it. I believe I can still steal the swan's plumage from the other two good-for-nothing princesses, said the Father Stork. Then they will not be able to go to the moor to work mischief. I will hide the swan skins themselves till they are wanted. Where will you hide them? Asked Mother Stork. In the nest of on the moor, he said. I and the youngest of our brood can be helped along with them, and if they are troublesome to us, there are plenty of places on the way where we can hide them until the next morning. One swan's dress should be enough for her. Two are better. It is still to have plenty of luggage to northern climates. You will get no thanks for it, said Mother Stork. However, you are the master, and I have nothing to say, except when I am sitting. Meanwhile, in the Viking stronghold near the moor, whither the storks flew at the spring, the little girl had received her name. They called her Helga, but that was far too sweet for such a disposition as the one who possessed this most beautiful child. Month after month it became more evident, and as years went by, whilst the storks pursued the same journey, in autumn towards the Nile and spring towards the moor, the little child became a grown girl. And before people thought it, she was in her 16th year, and she was the most beautiful of maidens. But the fruit was a beautiful shell. The kernel was hard and rough. She was wilder than most people, even in their gloomy age. She was a delight to her to splash the white hands of the hot blood of the horse, which had been slaughtered as a sacrifice. She in the wilderness, she bit off the neck of a black cock, which should have been slain by the heathen priests, and she said in sober earnest to her foster father, "If thine enemy came and tied a rope to the beams of the roof, and lifted it above thy chamber whilst thou wast asleep, I should not wake thee, even if I could. I would not hear it. My blood still so hums in my ears that thou shouldst have slapped me years ago. Thou, I remember." Damn kid. But the Viking did not believe what she said. He was, like the others, infatuated with her beauty, and he did not know how disposition and appearance changed little Helga. She would sit without a saddle, as if she had grown to the horse. When it galloped at full speed, she would not leap off, even when it fought with vicious horses. In all her clothes, she would often cast herself from the bank of the strong current of the fjord and swim to meet a Viking when its boat was steering towards land. She cut off the longest lock from her beautiful hair and made it into a string for her bow. "Self-made is well-made," she said. The Viking's wife, according to the age and custom, was strong in will and in disposition, but towards the daughter she seemed a mild and anxious woman, for she knew that the dreadful child was bewitched. When the mother stood on the balcony and watched out over the courtyard, it seemed as if Helga took an evil delight in placing herself on the edge of the well, extending her arms and legs, and then leaning plump into the narrow, deep hole, where she, with her frog nature, dived and rose again, and crawled out, just as if she was a cat, and came dripping with water into the lofty hall, so that the green leaves which were scattered on the floor floated about in a watery stream. But there was one bond that restrained little Helga, and that was the dusk of the evening, when she became quiet and pensive, and would allow herself to be called and led. She seemed to be drawn by some internal feeling to her mother, and when the sun went down and the transformations without and within her took place, she sat there quiet and melancholy, shrunken together into the figure of a toad. Her body, indeed, was now far larger than with the creatures, but it was only so much that more disgusting. She looked like a miserable dwarf with a frog's head and the web between her fingers. There was something of the deepest melancholy and expression in her eyes. She had no voice but a hollow moan, just like a child that sobs when it dreams. The Viking's wife could then take her to her knees and forgot the ugly form, looked only at the sorrowful eyes, and once more she said, "I could wish almost that thou wast always the dumb frog child. Thou art more frightful to look at when the beauty returns to thee." And she wrote runes against witchcraft and disease, and cast them over the wretched girl, but saw no change. Now that she was a full-grown woman, and so like the Egyptian mother, said Father Stork, one could not believe that she was once so little she lay in a water lily. We have never seen her mother since. She did not take care of herself, as you and the learned men thought. Year out, year in, I have flown now in all directions about the moor, and she has never made any sign. Yet, let me tell you that every year when I have to come up here some days ahead of you, to mend the nest and put one thing ahead straight of the other, I have flown for a single whole night, like an owl or a bat, to and fro over the open water. But it is no use, nor have I seen the two swan dresses of any use which the young ones I have dragged hither from the land to the Nile. Toilsome work it was, and it took us 3 journeys to do it. They have now lain for many years at the bottom of the nest, and if such disaster as the fire were to happen at any time, the log house would be burnt, and they would be lost. And our good nest would also be lost, said Mother Stork. You think too little of that, and too much of the feather dress. And your moss princess. You had better take it to her and stay in the bog. You're a useless father to your own family, and as I've said before since I sat on an egg for the first time, I only hope that we, our young ones, may not get an arrow from the Viking in the wing from the mad Viking girl. She does not know what she is doing. We have lived here longer than she has. She should remember. We never forget our obligations, and we pay our taxes yearly. A feather, an egg, and a young one, as is right. We do think, when she is outside, I feel inclined to go down there, as in the old days, and as I do in Egypt, where I am a half companion to them, without their forgetting of me, and peep into the tub and pots. No, I sit up here worrying myself about her, the hussy, and about you too. You ought to have let her lie in the water lily, and there would have been the end of her. You are kinder than your words, said Father Stork. I know you are better than you know yourself. And so he gave a jump and 2 heavy strokes of his wings, stretched his legs behind him, and off he flew. He sailed away without moving his wings. At a good distance he gave a powerful stroke, and the sun shone on his white feathers. He outstretched his neck and head forward, and that was the speed of flight. But he was still the handsomest of all of them, said the mother stork. I just don't tell him that. Early that autumn, the Viking came home with spoil and captives. Among those were a young Christian priest, one of those men who preached against the idols of the northern countries. Often at that period he did not talk in the hall, and the bar the women referred to the new faith, which he had made into his own countries of the south, and by the holy Icarus which had been brought by Hodi to the slave. Helga herself had heard of the faith of the White Christ, who out of love to men had given himself to save them. But for her, as I say, it had gone in one ear and out the other. She seemed to only have the perception of the word love when she crouched in that closed room of her miserable frog form. But the Viking's wife had listened to it, and felt herself wonderfully affected by the story and traditions of the son of the only true God. The men, on coming home from their expedition, had told of the splendid temples of costly hewn stone, erected for him whose message was love, and they had brought home with them a pair of golden vessels, elaborately pierced, and with fragrant odor about them, for they were censers, which the Christian priests used to swing before the altar, where no blood was ever shed, but wine and consecrated bread was changed into his body and blood, who had given himself for generations yet unborn. In the deep paved cellar of the long house, the young captive Christian priest was confined, his feet and hands securely bound. The Viking's wife said it was he that was as fair as Balder, and she was touched by his distress. But young Helga wished that a rope should be drawn through his legs, and that he should be tied to the tails of wild oxen, as one does. Then I would set the dogs loose. Hello, over the bog and fen, out the moor. That would be jolly to see him follow on his own course. But the Viking did not choose that he should be put to death that way. As a denier and opposer of the high gods, he should be offered the next morning on the bloodstone of the grove. The first time that a human sacrifice had been offered there. Young Helga asked that she might sprinkle the images of the gods and the people with his blood. She sharpened her gleaming knife, and when one of the great ferocious dogs, of which There were a good many in the courtyard, ran across her feet. She drove the knife into its side. To test it, she said. And the Viking's wife looked sadly at her, wild, ill-tempered girl. And when the night came, the beautiful bodily form of her daughter changed the beauty of her soul. She spoke glowing words and sorrow to her of her own afflicted spirits. The hideous toad with the goblin's body stood before her, and fixed its brown, sorrowful eyes on her, listening and seeming to understand with the intelligence of a human being. Never, even to my husband, has a word fallen from my tongue about the twofold nature I endure in thee, said the Viking's wife. There is more pity in my heart for thee than I could have believed. Great is the love of a mother, but affection never comes to thy mind. Thy heart is like cold clod. Whence didst thou then come into my house? At that the hideous form trembled and shook. It seemed as if the word touched her in some connection in the body and soul. Great tears came to its eyes. That bitter trial will come some time, said the Viking's wife, and terrible will it be for me. Better hast thou been abandoned on the highways a child, and the nice frost had lulled thee to thy death. And the Viking's wife wept bitter tears, and, wrathful and sad, passed behind the loose curtains which hung on the beam and divided the room. The shrunken toad sat alone in the corner. There was silence, but after a short interval there came from her breast a half-smothered sigh. It was as if, painfully, a soul awoke to life in the corner of her heart. She took one step forward, listened, then took another step. And then, when her awkward hands had seized the heavy bar that was placed before the door, gently pulled it back, and quietly she drew from the peg that was stuck in the latch. She took the lighted lamp that stood in front of the rooms. It seemed as if a strong will gave her power. She drew the iron pin out of the bolted shutter, and moved gently toward the prisoner. He was asleep. She touched him with her cold, damp hand, and when he awoke and saw the hideous form he shuddered, as if it was an evil vision. She drew her knife, severed his bonds, and made signs to him to follow her. He called upon the holy name, made the sign of the cross, and the figure stood unchanged, but repeated the words of the Bible. The Lord will preserve him and keep him alive. The Lord will deliver him in time of trouble. Who art thou? Whence is thy reptile shape that yet is so full of deeds of compassion? The toad figure beckoned and guided him behind the slithering curtains in a solitary way out of the stable, and pointed at a horse. He mounted it, and she seated herself before him, and held on to the mane of the animal. The prisoner understood her, and they rode away in a quick trot, by the path he would never have discovered out of the open hearth. He forgot her hideous form, for the favor and mercy of the Lord were acting through this hobgoblin. He offered up pious prayers and began to sing holy songs, and she trembled. Was it the power of his prayers and hymns that acted upon her, or was it the coldness of the morning which was so quickly coming? What was it she felt? She raised herself upon the breeze and wished to stop the horse and spring off, but the Christian priest held her fast with all his strength, and sang aloud a psalm, as if it were to have the power to loose the spell that held her in his hideous frog form, and the horse galloped forward yet more wildly. The heaven became red, and the first ray of the sun shot through the cloud, and with a clear spring of light came the change of form. She was a beautiful young girl, with a demonic evil temper. In his arms he held a peerless maiden. In utter terror he sprang from the horse and stopped it, for he thought that it was encountering a new and deadly witchcraft. But young Hilda at the same time leapt to the ground. The short child's frock reached into her knee, and she drew a sharp knife from her belt and rushed at the startled man. "Let me get at you," she cried. "Let me get at you. You shall feel the knife. You're as pale as hay, slave, beardless boy." She pressed him hard. They were engaged in severe conflict. But it was as if an unseen power gave strength to the Christian. He held her fast, and the old oak tree hard came by for his health. For its roots, half loosened from the earth, caught her feet as they slipped under them. A spring gushed forth quite close to them. He sprinkled her with fresh water on the breast and face, and charged the unclean spirit to come out of her, signing her with the cross according to the Christian rite. But the water of baptism had no power there, and the spring of faith had not yet risen within. Yet herein he was also strong. More than a man's strength against the rival power of evil he lay in his act, and as if he overwhelmed her, she dropped her arms, looked at him with surprise and pale cheeks, who seemed a powerful sorcerer, strong wizardry and secret lore. They were dark runes which he spoke, mystic signs which he was making in the air. She would not have blinked if he had swung an axe or a sharp knife before her eyes, but she did when he made that sign of the cross on her forehead and breast. She now sat like a tame bird, her head bowed down on the bosom. Gently he told her the work of love that she had done for him that night, that she had come to the hideous form of a frog and had loosened his bonds, and brought him out to the light and life. It said also that she was bound in a closer bondage than he had been, but she too with him should come to the light and life. He would bring her to Hadabe, the holy anchoress. There, in a Christian city, the enchantment would be broken. But he would not dare carry her in front of him on the horse, although she herself was willing to sit there. "You must sit behind me on the horse, not in front of me. Thy witch beauty has a power that is the form of the evil one. I dread it, and there is yet a victory for me in Christ." He's afraid to get turned on. He bent his knees and prayed gently and earnestly. It was as if the silent glades of the forest had consecrated thereby unto a holy church. The birds began to sing as if they belonged to a new brotherhood. The mint poured forth its fragrance as if it would take place in a holy incense. The priest proclaimed aloud the words of the holy writ. "The dayspring from the high hath visited us, to give light to them who sit in darkness and in shadow of death, and to guide our feet into the way of peace." And he spoke about the longing of the whole creation, and whilst he spoke to the horse, which had carried them in this wild race, it stood quiet and shook the terrible brambles, so that ripe juicy berries fell on little Elga's hand, offering themselves for her refreshments. Patiently she let herself be lifted onto the back of the horse, and sat there while one walks in his sleep, is not awake, but yet not moving in his dream. The Christian fastened two bows together with a sharp strip of bark to form a cross, and held it aloft in his hands. So they rode through the forest, which became denser and grew way deeper, and rather so that no way at all. Sloes grew across the path, and one was obligated to ride around them. The spring did not become a running brook, but a standing bog, and one had to ride around that. There was strength and refreshment in the fresh forest air. There was not less power in the word of gentleness which sounded in faith of Christian love, and the heartfelt desire to bring the possessed to light and love. They say that the drops of the rain can hollow the hard stone. The billows of the sea can Time wears smooth, broken, sharpened edges of pieces of rock. The dew of grace which had descended upon little Helga pierced the hardness and roughness of her nature, although it was not yet evident, and she was not yet aware of it herself. But what does the germ in the earth know of the refreshing moisture and the warm rays of the sun, while yet it is hidden within the plant and flower? As the mother's song for her child imperceptibly fastens itself into its mind, and it babbles single words after her, without understanding them, although they afterwards collect themselves into thoughts and become clear in the course of time, so in her the word worked which is able to create. They rode out of the forest, over the heath, again through the pathless forest. Towards evening they met some robbers. "Where have thou stolen that fair maiden?" they shouted. They stopped the horse and snatched the two riders from it, for they were strong men. The priest had no other weapon than the knife which he had taken from little Helga to defend himself with. One of the robbers swung his axe, but the young Christian avoided it and lightly sprang aside, or he would have been struck. But the edge of the axe sank deep into the horse's neck, so that the blood streamed out and the animal fell to the earth. Then little Helga started, as if awakened out of a long, deep meditation, and threw herself down on the expiring animal. The Christian priest placed himself before her in order to defend her, but one of the robbers dashed the ponderous iron mace against his forehead, crushing it. The blood and brains spurted around, and he fell to the earth. The robbers seized little Helga by her white arm. In that moment the sun went down, and as the last ray faded, she was changed into the hideous toad. Her greenish mouth opened across half her face. Her arm came within thin and slimy, and her hands girthed and broad and covered with ribbing. Terror seized the robbers at the sight, and she stood among them, a hideous monster. Then, frog-like, hopped away with bounds of higher than she was herself, and vanished into the thicket. The robbers knew it was an evil trick for a lodge or secret magic art, and hurried away in fright. The full moon was already rising, and soon shone forth in splendor, and little Helga crept forth in the thicket with the skin of a wretched toad. She stood by the bodies of the Christian priest and the horse, and she looked at them with eyes that seemed to weep. The frog's head uttered a moan, like a child beginning to cry. She threw herself now upon one, now upon the other. She took water in her hand, which she had webbed skin made larger and more hollow, and poured it on them. They were dead, and would remain dead. She understood that. Wild animals would soon come and devour their bodies, but that must not be. So she dug in the earth as deep as she could. To open a grave for them was her wish, but she had nothing to dig with except for the strong bough of a tree and her weak hands. But on one of them there was webbing that stretched between her fingers. She tore it, and the blood flowed. This means it would be of no use. She could see it. Then she took water and washed the dead man's face and covered it with fresh green leaves, fetched great boughs and laid it over them, took the leaves between them, and then took the heaviest stones she was able to lift and laid them over the dead bodies, and filled up the openings with moss. Then the mound seemed strong and protected, but this arduous task was accompanied and had occupied the entire nights. The sun now burst forth, and little Helga stood in all her beauty, with bleeding hands, and, for the first time, with tears on her flushed maiden cheeks. With this transformation it seemed as if her two natures struggled within her. She trembled and gazed around her as if she had woke from a frightful dream. Running into a slender beech, she held fast onto it for support, then climbed to the top of the tree as lithely as a cat and clung fast to it. There she sat like a frightened squirrel, sat there all through the day in the deep solitude of the forest, where all is still and deathlike, as they say. Yet a pair of butterflies fluttered out to play and quarrel. There were ants close by with many hundreds of little creatures crowded backwards and forward. Countless gnats danced in the air, swam swarm upon swarm. Hosts of buzzing flies chased each other about. Birds, dragonflies, and other winged creatures filled the air. The earthworm crept out of its most soil. The mole raised itself above the ground. It was all still deathlike around, but what one calls deathlike indeed. Nothing took notice of little Helga, except the jays, which flew screaming about the top of the tree where she was sitting. They jumped along the branches near her, daring inquisitiveness. One glance of her eye was enough to chase them away again, but they could not quite make her out. Neither could she understand herself. When evening was near and the sun began to go down, her approaching change called her to movement again. She let herself slide down the tree, and when the last rays of the sun disappeared, she sat on the toad's shrunken form, with the webbed skin of her hands lacerated. But her eyes now sparkled with a brilliancy of beauty which they had scarcely possessed before, even in her beautiful human shape. They were now in the gentle eyes of the pious maiden that looked upon behind the reptile's outward shape, and told of a deepened mind, of a true human heart. Beautiful eyes swam with tears, heavy tears, and that relieved her heart. The cross of boughs bound together with the strip of bark, the last work of him, who now lay dead and buried, was still laying on the grave that she had made. Little Helga now took it, at some unprompted impulse, and planted it amongst the stone over him and the slain horse. The sadness of the recollection brought tears to her eyes, and with the grief in her heart she traced the same sign in the earth around the grave that so horribly enclosed the dead. As with both hands she traced the sign of the cross, the webbing fell off like a torn glove. She washed herself in the water of the spring, and looked with astonishment at her fine white hands. Again she made the sign of the cross in the air between herself and the grave. Her lips quivered, her tongue moved, and that name, which she had heard pronounced most frequently on her ride through the forest, came audibly from her mouth. She said, Jesus Christ. The toad's skin fell off. She was a beautiful young maiden, but her head drooped wearily. Her limbs needed repose. She slept. Her slumber was short. At midnight she awoke. The dead horse was standing before her, shining, full of life. It gleamed in the light of its own eyes and from its wounded neck. Close by she saw the murdered Christian priest, more beautiful than Balder, as the Viking's wife had once said. He appeared surrounded with a glory of fire. There was an earnest look in his large, gentle eyes, just and searching, so penetrating a gaze that it seemed to shine upon the inmost recesses of her heart. Little Helga trembled before it, and her memory was awakened with a power as if it was the day of judgment. Every kind action that had been done for her, every kindly word that had been spoken to her, seemed endued in life. She understood that it was a mercy which had taken care of her during days of trial, which the child of spirits in day works and strives. She owned that she had only followed the bent of her own desire, and had done nothing on her own part. Everything had been given to her. Everything had been allowed, so to speak. She bowed herself humbly, ashamed before him alone can read the hidden things of her heart. And in that instant there seemed to come a fiery touch of purifying flame, the flame of the Holy Spirit. Thou daughter of mire, said the priest, from the mire, from the earth thou art sprung, from earth thou shalt rise again. The fire within these returns in personality to the source. The ray is not from the sun, but from God. No soul shall perish, but far distant is the time when life shall be merged into eternity. I come from the land of the dead, so shalt thou at some time travel through the deep valley in the shining of hill country, where grace and fulfillment dwell. I may not lead thee to Hadith or Christian baptism. First thou must burst the water shield over the deep moorland, and draw up the living roots that gave thee life and cradled thee. Thou must do thy work before the consecration may come to thee. And he lifted her onto the horse, handed her a golden censer, like that she had seen in the Viking's castle, and which came the sweet, strong fragrance. The open wound on the forehead of the slain horse shone like a radiant diadem. He took the cross from the grave and raised it high, and now they went off through the air, wrestled over forests and through the mounds where the warriors were buried. Sitting on their dead steeds, and those majestic forms rose and rode out of the tops of the hills. A broad golden hoop with a gold knob gleamed on their foreheads in the moonlight, and their cloaks fluttered in the wind. The dragon that sits and broods over treasure raised its head and looked after them. Dwarves peered forth from the hills, and the furrows swarmed with red, blue, and green lights, like the cluster of sparks on a burnt piece of paper. Away over wood and heath, stream and pool, they flew to the moor and floated over the great circles. The Christian priest raised the cross on high. It shone like gold, and from his lips came an enthusiastic chant. Little Helga sang with him, as a child joins in a song from its mother. She swung the censer, and there came the fragrance from it of an altar, so powerful and subtly operating that the rushes and reeds of the moor put forth their flowers. All the germs sprang up from the deep soil, everything that in life arose. A veil of water lilies spread itself like embroidered carpet of flowers, and on it lay a sleeping woman, young and beautiful. Little Helga thought she saw herself mirrored in the water, but it was her mother that she saw, the Marsh king's wife, the princess from the waters of the Nile. The dead Christian priest bade the sleeper be lifted onto the horse, but that sank under the burden of its only to be winding sheet flying in the breeze. But the sign of the cross made the airy phantom strong, and all three rode on the firm ground. The cock crowed in the Viking stronghold. The phantoms rose up in the mist and were dispersed in the wind, but mother and daughter stood there together. "Is that myself that I see in the deep water?" said the mother. "Is that myself that I see in the bright shield?" exclaimed the daughter, and they came close together, breast to breast in each other's arms. The mother's heart beat strongest, and understood it all. "My child, my own heart's flower, my lotus from the deepest waters." And she embraced her child, and wept over her, and the tears were a baptism of new life, and affection for little Helga. "I came hither in a swan's skin, and I took it off," said the mother. "I sank through the quivering swamp, deep into the mire of the bog, and closed me with a wall. But soon I found a fresher current about me. The water seemed to draw me deeper and deeper. I felt a pressure of sleep on my eyelids. I slept. I dreamt. I seemed to lie again in the pyramids of Egypt. But there stood still before me the odor of the sun, which had frightened me on the surface of the moor. I looked at the crevices of the bark, and they shone forth colors and became hieroglyphics. It was the case of the mummy which I was looking for. That burst, and out of it stepped the Lord of 1,000 years old, mummy-formed, black as pitch, shining black like a wood snail, with slimy black mud. The Marsh King, or the mummy of the pyramid, I did not know which. He flung his arms about me, and I felt that I should die. When I first returned to life again and my breast became warm, there was a little bird which beat its wings and twittered and sang. It flew up to the breast toward the dark, heavy roof, but a long green band was fastened to me. I heard and I understood its longing noises. Liberty, sunshine to the Father! And then I thought of my father in the sunlit land, of my home, my life, my affection. And I loosed the band and let him flutter away, home to his father. Since that hour I've not dreamed. I slept a long and heavy sleep till the moment when the sounds and the fragrance arose and raised me. That green band from my mother's heart to the bird's wings, whither had it passed now? Where is it lying cast away? Only the stork had seen it. The band that was a green stalk and knot, that was a shining flower which served as a cradle for my child, who now has grown into a beauty, and again reposed near her mother's heart. And whilst they stood in the close embrace, the father stork flew in circles about them, made speed to his nest, and fetched thence the feather dresses, kept for so many years, and threw one over each of them. And they flew and raised themselves from the earth as two white swans. "Let us talk," said Father Stork, "now that we can understand each other's speech, although the beak is cut differently from one bird than it is another. It is most lucky thing that you came tonight. In the morning we should have been off, Mother and I, and the young ones. We're flying to the south. Yes, look at me. I am an old friend from the land of the Nile, and that is Mother. She has more in her heart than her chatter. She always believed that the princess was only taking care of herself. I and the young ones have brought the swanskins here. Well, how glad I am, and what a fortunate thing that I am here still. At daybreak we shall set off, a large party of storks. We'll fly in front, you can fly behind, and then you will not mistake the way. I and the young ones will then be able to keep an eye upon you." "And the lotus flower that I ought to bring," said the Egyptian princess, "that flies in swan's plumage by my side. I have the flower of my heart with me. Thus it has released itself. Homeward, homeward!" But Helga said that she could not leave the land of Denmark till she had once more seen her foster mother, kind wife of the Viking. In Helga's thoughts came up a very beautiful remembrance, very affectionate word. Every tear which her foster mother had shed, it was almost seemed that the instant as if she clung closest to that mother. "Yes, we will go to the Viking's house," said the stork father. "There I expect Mother and the young ones. How they will open their eyes and chatter about it. Yes, Mother doesn't say very much. What she does is short and pithy, and so she thinks the best. I will sound the rattle directly, so that she will hear we are coming." And so the father stork chattered his beak, and flew with the swans to the Viking stronghold. Everyone there was lying deep in slumber. The Viking's wife had not gone to rest till late in the night. She was still in fear of little Helga, who had disappeared 3 days ago, with the Christian priest. She must have helped him escape, for it was her horse that was missing from the stable. By what power had all this been brought about? The Viking's wife thought about the wonderful works which she had heard performed by the White Christ, and by those who believed in him and followed him. Her changing thoughts had shaped themselves into a dream. It appeared to her that she was still remaining in bed, awake, and meditating, and that darkness shrouded everything outside. A storm arose, and she heard the rolling of the sea to the west and the east. From the North Sea, the waters of Kennego, that huge serpent which encircles the earth in the depths of the ocean shook convulsively. It was Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, as his heathen called the last hour, when everything should pass away, and even the gods themselves. The trumpet sounded, and the gods rode forth over the rainbows, arrayed in steel, to take in the last contest. Before them flew the winged warrior maidens. Behind them the ray of marched the forms of dead warriors. The whole sky was illuminated by the northern lights, but the darkness again prevailed, as it was an appalling hour. And close by the frightened Viking wife's little Helga sat on the floor in the hideous form of a toad, trembling and nestling herself upon the foster mother, who took her on her lap and affectionately held her fast, although she seemed more hideous than a toad. The air was full of the seconds and sound strokes of blow of maces and arrows whizzing, as if a furious hailstorm was raging above them. The hour had come when earth and the heavens should fall, the stars should fall, and everything be burned up in the fire of Surtur. But the dreamer knew that a new earth would heaven come, and the corn wave would wave where the sea now rolled, over the barren sand bottoms. That the god who cannot be named rules, and up to him rose Balder, gentle and kind. Loose from the realm of the dead, he came. The Viking's wife saw him, and knew his face. It was a captive Christian priest. "White Christ!" she cried out, and she motioned at the name. She pressed the kiss of the his forehead of her frog child. The toad skin fell off, and little Helga stood there in all her beauty, gentle as if she had never been before, and with beaming eyes. She kissed her father and mother's hands, blessed her for all her care and affection with which she had been surrounded for her days in her distress and trial, thanked her for the thoughts in which she had given birth to her, and thanked her for the mentioning of the name which she uttered, White Christ. And then little Helga rose up as a noble swan. Her wings expanded themselves wide, wide with the rustling of a white flock of birds as the passage flies away. With that, the Viking's wife awoke, and still heard outside the same strong sound of wings. She knew that it was time for the storks to depart, and no doubt that was what she had heard. Still, she wished to see them once before their journey, and to bid them farewell. She stood up and went out onto her balcony, and there she saw on the ridge of the outhouse rows of storks, and round the courtyard, over the lofty trees, and others were flying in great circles. But straight in front of her, on the edge of the wall, where little Helga had often sat, and frightened her with her wildness, two swans now sat and looked at her with intelligent eyes. A dream came to her mind. It filled her with quite the reality. She thought of little Helga in the form of a swan. She thought of the Christian priest, and she felt a strange joy in her heart. The swans beat their wings and bent their necks as if they wished to salute her. The Viking's wife stretched out her arms towards them as she understood, and smiled at them through her tears. Then, with a noise of wings and chattering, all the storks arose to start their journey to the south. "We cannot wait for the swans," said Mother Stork. "If they wish to come with us, they may, but we can't wait here until the plovers start. It's a very good thing to travel in family parties, but not to show friends and ruffs, where the males fly by themselves and the females by themselves. That is certainly not proper. And what are those swans flapping their wings for?" "Everyone flies in their own way," said Father Stork. "The swans go in a slanting way, the cranes go in a triangle, and the plovers go in wavy snake-like line." "Don't mention serpents when you're flying up there," said Mother Stork. "It only excites the appetites of the young ones when they can't be satisfied." "Are those on the high mountains which I have heard of?" asked Helga to the swanskin. Those are thunderclouds which drive below us, said the mother. What are those white clouds which lift themselves so high? Asked Helga. Those are the everlasting snow-clad hills which you see, said the mother. And they flew over the Alps towards the blue Mediterranean Sea. Land of Africa, coast of Egypt, jubilantly sang the daughter of the Nile in her swan form, when high in the air she descried her native land like a bluish-white undulating streak. And as the birds saw it, they hastened their flight. I smell the mud of the Nile and the wet frogs, said Mother Stork. It quite excites me. Yes, now you shall taste them. Now you shall see the junk bird and the ibis and the cranes. They all belong to our family, but they are not nearly so handsome as we are. They stick themselves up, especially in the ibis. He is now quite pampered by the Egyptians. They make a mummy of him and stuff him with aromatic herbs. I'd rather be stuffed with live frogs, and so would you. So should you be. It is better to have something inside of you while you live than to be in the right state when you're dead. That's their opinion, and oh, it's right. Now the storks are come, said the rich house in the high bank of the Nile, where in the open hall, on soft cushions covered with leopard skins, the royal master lay outstretched, neither living nor dead, hoping for the lotus flower from the deep marsh of the north. Kinsmen and servants stood around him, and into the hall flew two beautiful white swans, which had come with the storks. They flew off their dazzling feather dress, and there stood two beautiful women, as much alike as two drops of dew. They bent down over the pale, withered old man. They pulled back their long hair, while little Helga stooped to let her grandfather, her hair covered to his cheeks, his eyes sparkled, and life came to his stiffened limbs. The old man raised himself healthy and vigorous. Daughter and granddaughter held him in their arms, as if they were giving him morning salutation in their joy after a long, heavy dream. And there was joy all over the house, and in the stork's nest, but it was chiefly over good food, and swarming hosts of frogs, and while learned men make haste to note down so brief the history of the two princesses and the flower of health, which was such a great event and blessing for house and country. The parent storks related in their own fashion to their own family, but not till they had satisfied their hunger, or else they would have had something else to do than listen to stories. Now you will become somebody, whispered Mother Stork. That is certain. Well, what should I become? Said Father Stork. And what have I done? A mere nothing. You have done more than all the others. But for you, the young ones and the two princesses would never have seen Egypt again, and made the old man well. You will be somebody. You will certainly receive a doctor's degree, and our young ones will hear about it afterwards, and their young ones will have it in turn. You already look like an Egyptian doctor in my eyes. Yeah. The wise and learned expounded the fundamental idea, as they called it, and they ran through the whole history. Love brings forth life. They gave the explanation in different ways. The warm sunbeam was the Egyptian princess. She descended to the Marsh king, and in their meeting the flowers sprang forth. I can't repeat the words quite right, said Father Stork, who had heard it from the roof, and was expected to tell them all about it in his nest. What they said was so involved, it was so clever, that they immediately received honors and gifts. Even when the head cook obtained the high mark of distinction. That was for the soup. And what did you receive? Inquired Mother Stork. They ought not forget the most important, and that is yourself. The learned only learn to chatter about it, but your turn will come. Late that night, while peaceful slumber enwrapped the now prosperous house, There was one who was still awake. That was not the father stork, though he stood on one leg in the nest and slept like a sentinel. No, little Helga was awake. She leaned over the balcony and gazed in the clear sky, which was great and full of bright stars, larger and purer in their luster than she had ever seen in the north, and yet the same. She thought of the Viking's wife by the moor, and her foster mother's gentle eyes, and the tears she had shed over the poor toad child, who now stood in the light and splendor of the stars by the waters of the Nile in the soft air of spring. She thought of the love of the heathen woman's breast, that love which she had shown to the miserable creature who, in human form, was an evil brute, and in the form of an animal, loathsome to look at and to touch. She looked at the shining stars and called to mind the splendor on the forehead of the dead man, when they flew over the forest and moor. Tones resounded in her recollection, words she had heard pronounced when they rode away, and she sat as if paralyzed. Words about the great author of love, the highest love, embracing all generations. Yes, how much had been given, gained, and obtained. Little Helga's thoughts were occupied night and day with all her good fortune, and she stood in contemplation of it like a child which turns quickly from the giver to the beautiful presents that have been given. So she rose up in her increasing happiness, which could come and would come. She was indeed born in mysterious ways to an even higher joy and happiness, and in this she lost herself so entirely that she thought no more of the giver. It was a strength of beautiful courage that inspired her bold venture. Her eyes shone. Suddenly she was called back to the great clamor of the courtyard beneath. There she saw two powerful ostriches running hurriedly in the narrow circles. She had never before seen that creature, so great a bird, so clumsy and heavy. Its wings looked as though they were clipped, the bird itself as if it had been injured, and she inquired what had been done to it, and for the first time heard the tradition of the Egyptians related to the ostrich. The race had at one time been beautiful, its wings large and powerful. Then one evening a mighty forest bird said to it, "Brother, shall we fly to the river in the morning, if God will, and drink?" The ostrich replied, "I will." When day broke they flew off, and at first high up towards the sun, the eye of God, even higher and higher, the ostrich far before all the others. It flew with its pride towards the light. It relied on its own strength, and not that of the giver. It did not say, "If God will," and then the avenging angel drew back the veil of burning flame, and in an instant the bird's wings were burnt, sank miserably to the earth, its descendants no longer able to rise themselves. They fly in terror, rush about in circles in that narrow space. It is a reminder to us men, in all our thoughts, in all our actions, to say, "If God will." And Helga thoughtfully bowed her head, looked at the hurrying ostrich, and saw its fear. Saw its silly delight in the sight of its own great shadow on the white sunlit wall. And deep seriousness fixed itself upon her mind and thoughts. So rich a life, so full of prosperity, was given, was obtained. What would happen? What is yet to come? The best thing, if God will. In the early spring, when the storks started in the north, little Helga took her gold bracelet, scratched her name on it, and beckoned for Father Stork, and placed a gold circlet about his neck, and asked him to bear it to the Viking wife, by which she would understood that her foster daughter was alive, and so she was happy and thought of her. "That is heavy to carry," thought the stork father, as he placed it around his neck. "But one does not throw gold in honor of the high road. They will find it true up there, and the stork brings fortune. You lay gold, and I lay eggs, said the stork mother. But you lay only once, and I lay every year. But it vexes me that neither of us is appreciated. But we are quite aware of it ourselves, mother, said Father Stork. But you can't hang that on you, said Mother Stork. It neither gives us fair wind nor food. And so they flew. The little nightingale that sang in its tamarind bush also wished to start for the north immediately. Little Helga had often heard him up near the moor, and wished to give him a message, for she understood the speech of birds when she flew in the swanskin, and she had often since used the stork and the swallow. The nightingale would understand her, and she asked him to fly to the beech forest of the peninsula of Jutland, where she had erected a grave of stones and boughs. There she asked him to bid all the small birds to protect the graves, and always to sing their songs around it. And the nightingale flew, and time flew also. The eagle stood on the pyramid in the autumn, and saw the magnificent array of richly clad camels, with armed men in costly clothing, on the soaring Arabian steeds, shining as white as silver, and with red quivering nostrils, their heavy, thick manes hanging down from their slender legs. Rich visitors, a royal prince from the end of Arabia, beautiful as a prince ought to be, came to the noble house, where the stork's nest now stood empty, its former occupants now far away in the northern lands, but soon to return. And they came exactly on that day which was filled most with joy and mirth. There was a grand wedding, and little Helga was the bride, arrayed in silk and jewels. The bridegroom was a young prince from the land of Arabia, and two sat highest at the table between the mother and grandmother. But she did not look at the bridegroom's round, manly cheek, where his black beard curled. She did not look at the dark, fiery eyes, which were fastened upon her. She looked upwards and outwards towards the twinkling, sparkling stars, which beamed above them from heaven. And there was a rustling sound of strong wing strokes outside in the air. The storks had returned. And the old couple, however tired they might be with the journey, and however much they needed rest, still flew onto the railing of the veranda. Immediately they were aware of the festivities it was. They had already heard of the frontier country that little Helga had allowed them to be painted on the wall because they belonged to her history. That is very nicely borne in mind, said Father Stork. It is very little, said Stork Mother. She could have done less. But when Helga saw them, she got up and went over to the veranda and to them and pat them on the back. The old storks curtsied on their necks, and the youngest of the young ones looked on and felt themselves honored. Helga looked up to the bright stars, which them had shone cleaner and clearer, and between them and her form seemed to move still purer than the air, and seen through it, that hovered quite near her. It was the dead Christian priest. He came on the day of her festivity, came from the kingdom of heaven. The splendor and glory which are there surpass everything earth knows, he says. And little Helga prayed gently and from her heart, as she had never prayed before, that she only for one single minute might dare look within, might only cast one single glance into the kingdom of heaven, to the Father of all. And he raised her into splendor and glory in one current of sounds and thoughts. It was not only round her that it shone and sounded, but within her. No words are able to describe it. Now we must return. You are wanted, he said. Only one glance more, she entreated. Only 1 short minute. We must go back to Earth. All the guests have gone away. Only one glance, the last. And little Helga stood outside on the veranda, but all the torches outside were extinguished. All the lights in the wedding chamber were gone. The storks were gone. No guests were to be seen. No bridegroom. Everything seemed to be blown away in the 3 short minutes. Then Helga was filled with terror, and she went through the great empty hall into the next room. Strange soldiers were sleeping there. She opened a side door that led to her apartment, and when she expected to stand there, she found herself outside in the garden. It was not like this before. The heaven was red and shining. It was towards daybreak. Only 3 minutes in heaven, and the whole night had passed on earth. Then she saw the storks and cried to them, speaking their language. The father stork turned his head and listened and drew near her. "You're speaking our language," she said. "What do you want? Why do you come here, you strange woman?" "His eyes, Helga, don't you know me? 3 minutes ago we were talking together, yonder on the veranda." "This is a mistake," said the stork. "You must have dreamt it." "No, no," she said, and reminded him of the Viking stronghold and of the moor of the journey hither. Then Father Stork blinked his eyes. "That is a very old story. I have heard it from my great-great-great-grandmother's time. Yes, certainly there is such a princess in Egypt from the land of Denmark, and she disappeared the night of her wedding many hundreds of years ago and never came back. That you may read for yourself on the monument in the garden. There are sculpted both swans and storks. On top of you yourself stand in white marble." Oops. It was indeed so. Little Helga saw it, and understood it, and fell to her knees. The sun broke forth, and in her former times it touched as if the beams of the toad had disappeared. The beautiful shape was seen. She was so raised herself now in the baptism of light, the former the brighter beauty, purer than the air, the ray of light to the Father of all. Her body sank in dust. There lay the faded lotus flower where she stood. "Then that is the ending of the story," said Father Stork. "I had not expected it at all, but rather like it." "I wonder what my young ones will say about it," said Mother Stork. "Yes, that is certainly the principal thing," answered the father. Okay, that story went all over the place. I got lost several times, but I just kept reading. Oh. That took a lot longer than I thought it would, too. I was expecting to get through 3 stories, not just 2. Oh, I am over halfway through the book. Damn. 2.5 hours, yeah. Wow. That story took forever. How many pages was that thing? So that was Marsh King's Daughter. 50 pages. Okay, yeah, that's the same length that the Snow Queen was. At least the Snow Queen kept ugh. Yeah, that story was 54 pages long, and there were at least um, 4 or 5 full-page pictures in it. Man, this run was longer than I expected it to be. I know that my vision's slowly coming back to proper focus. So I should see who to raid, because dusk is on. And Altered is on. Altered is doing creepypasta. So of the people on that I raid, I've got one that is reading more stories. Or looks like Dusk is playing Overwatch. Yeah, I think we'll continue the story theme. Altered Entertainment is reading by Campfire, which he's reading creepypasta stories. So. Well, let's see. One of my friends, another author, he will actually do writing streams. Uh, it's like he'll like maybe write a chapter while streaming, but he also gets distracted by his daughter, and or you could read your stories while you're doing it, because I know at least two other people who do those. Mm. Yeah. I try to be. That's why I always worry about coughing during streams, because I'll just get into a coughing fit and it just goes nonstop. I have to say, Altered Entertainment, who was lurking earlier, he's got a pretty good voice too. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's been kind of a debate on what we should put our captions on when we're doing reading. Because I do story time. He does his on just chatting. Uh, man, damn, that story was long. But I'm halfway through this book already. Yeah. Man, pretty sure that Kaufman is supposed to be non-drowsy. Oh, yeah. Oh, I've got a shelf of books I was going to read. So I was also trying to. I've got the Vanishing Hitchhiker book, which I thought I lost it, and now end up finding it. So this means I need to get that campsite story thing set up so I can do there. Ugh. But yeah, I think we may read in and keep listening to more stories. Let's pop over here. Yeah, Altered is reading creepypasta stories, so yeah, yeah. Well, can't see her on my keyboard. Yeah. Yeah, I keep leaning too close to the camera, so I'm getting off screen. Anyway, Red Altered. Ugh. Yeah. Anyway, uh, thanks for coming in and listening. That's some more spooky stories to listen to. So, guess I'll see you over there. Have a good night.